The morning sun cast long shadows across the grand corridors of Windsor Castle as 8-year-old Prince George walked quietly beside his bodyguard, Officer Marcus Thompson. The palace was bustling with its usual morning activities, servants hurrying with breakfast trays, gardeners tending to the royal gardens, and staff members preparing for another day of royal duties. George had always been different from other children his age. While most kids would run around making noise and demanding attention, he moved through the palace halls with gentle steps and observant eyes. His teachers often remarked how he seemed to notice things that others missed: a worried expression on a servant's face, a gardener struggling with heavy equipment, or a new staff member looking lost in the maze of palace corridors. On this particular Tuesday morning, George was heading to his mathematics lesson when he noticed something unusual. Mrs. Eleanor Heartfelt, the head of palace housekeeping, was sitting on a small bench near the servants' entrance. Her usually perfect posture was slumped, and she was staring at an envelope in her trembling hands. George had known Mrs. Heartfelt since he was very small. She had been working at the palace for over 30 years and always greeted him with a warm smile and kind words. Officer Thompson noticed the prince had slowed his pace. "Your Highness, we need to get to your lesson," he said gently, checking his watch. The royal schedule was always precise, and being late was not something the palace staff took lightly. But George couldn't shake the image of Mrs. Heartfelt looking so upset. He had never seen her without her usual cheerful demeanor. Throughout his mathematics lesson, he found himself distracted, thinking about the sad expression on her face. His tutor, Mr. Peterson, had to call his name twice to get his attention back to the algebra problems they were working on. When the lesson ended, George asked Officer Thompson if they could take a different route back to his quarters. The bodyguard, used to the young prince's curious nature, agreed. As they walked through the corridors, George kept his eyes open, hoping to see Mrs. Heartfelt again. He wanted to understand what had made her so unhappy. Later that afternoon, during his free time, George found himself in the palace library. Instead of reading his usual adventure books, he sat by the large window that overlooked the staff courtyard. He watched as various palace employees went about their duties, but his mind kept returning to Mrs. Heartfelt and the envelope that had seemed to cause her so much distress. His grandmother, Queen Elizabeth, had always taught him that being royal meant caring for others, especially those who worked hard to serve the family and the country. She often told him stories about how small acts of kindness could make enormous differences in people's lives. George had listened to these lessons carefully, but today felt like the first time he truly understood what she meant. As evening approached and the palace began to settle into its quieter nighttime rhythm, George made a decision. He would find out what was troubling Mrs. Heartfelt. He didn't know exactly how he would help, but he knew he had to try. The 8-year-old prince had no idea that his simple desire to help would soon touch the hearts of everyone in the palace and create a moment that would be remembered for years to come. That night, as he lay in his bed looking up at the ornate ceiling of his room, George thought about courage. Not the kind of courage that knights showed in the stories he loved to read, but the quiet courage it took to reach out to someone who was hurting. He fell asleep determined to find a way to help Mrs. Heartfelt, unaware that his actions would soon demonstrate the true meaning of royal compassion to everyone around him. The next morning, George woke up earlier than usual. The palace was still quiet, with only the soft footsteps of the early morning staff echoing through the corridors. He dressed quickly and asked Officer Thompson if they could walk through the housekeeping department on their way to breakfast. The bodyguard raised an eyebrow but agreed, knowing that the young prince often had good reasons for his unusual requests. As they approached the housekeeping area, George could hear Mrs. Heartfelt's voice giving instructions to the cleaning staff. But something was different about her tone. It lacked the usual warmth and energy. When they rounded the corner, George saw her standing with her back to them, her shoulders slightly hunched as she checked items off a clipboard. "Good morning, Mrs. Heartfelt," George said softly, not wanting to startle her. She turned around quickly, and George could see that her eyes were red and puffy, as if she had been crying. She immediately straightened up and forced a smile. "Good morning, Your Highness. You're up early today." George studied her face carefully. His grandmother had taught him to really look at people when they spoke, to notice not just their words but their expressions and body language. Mrs. Heartfelt was trying very hard to appear normal, but George could see the sadness she was trying to hide. "Are you feeling all right?" George asked, his young voice filled with genuine concern. Mrs. Hartwell's forced smile wavered for just a moment. "Oh yes, Your Highness, just a bit tired. Nothing for you to worry about," but George was worried. He spent the rest of the morning thinking about their brief conversation and the way Mrs. Hartwell had looked away when she said she was fine. During his history lesson, he found himself drawing absent-minded sketches in his notebook margins instead of taking notes about the Tudor dynasty. At lunch, George decided to ask his personal assistant, Miss Sarah Collins, about Mrs. Hartwell. Miss Collins had been working at the palace for 5 years and seemed to know everyone and everything that happened within the royal household. "Miss Collins," George said carefully, "do you know if anything is troubling Mrs. Hartwell lately? She seems upset about something." Miss Collins looked surprised by the question. "You noticed that? You're very observant, Your Highness. I'm not sure it's appropriate for me to discuss staff matters with you." George understood the boundaries that existed in the palace, but his concern for Mrs. Hartwell was growing stronger. "I just want to help if I can. She's always been so kind to me." Miss Collins softened at the genuine care in the young prince's voice. After a moment of consideration, she leaned closer and spoke quietly. "I heard through the grapevine that her son James might be having some serious health problems. Apparently he needs an expensive surgery that the family insurance doesn't fully cover." George's heart sank. Mrs. Hartwell had often talked about her son James with such pride. He was studying to become a teacher and had always dreamed of working with children who had learning difficulties. The thought of him being sick and Mrs. Hartwell being worried about money made George feel a deep sadness he had never experienced before. That afternoon, instead of playing his usual games or reading, George sat in his room thinking hard about the situation. He remembered his father, Prince William, once telling him that having privilege meant having the responsibility to help others when possible. George had his own savings account, money he had received for birthdays and holidays that he rarely spent. The idea that was forming in his mind seemed both simple and complicated at the same time. He wanted to help Mrs. Hartwell with her son's medical expenses, but he knew he couldn't just walk up to her and offer money. The palace had strict protocols about interactions between the royal family and staff members, and he didn't want to embarrass Mrs. Hartwell or make her feel uncomfortable. As evening fell, George made another decision. He would talk to his father about the situation. Prince William had always encouraged his children to come to him when they had questions or concerns, no matter how big or small. Perhaps his father would know the right way to help Mrs. Hartwell without breaking any palace rules or making her feel awkward about accepting assistance. George fell asleep that night with a sense of purpose. He didn't yet know exactly how things would unfold, but he was determined to find a way to help the woman who had shown him such kindness throughout his young life. The following evening, George found his father in the private study reviewing official documents by the warm glow of a desk lamp. Prince William looked up as his son entered, immediately noticing the serious expression on the 8-year-old's face. "Dad, can I talk to you about something important?" George asked, climbing into the comfortable chair across from his father's desk. Prince William set aside his papers and gave George his full attention. "Of course, son. What's on your mind?" George took a deep breath and carefully explained everything he had observed about Mrs. Hartwell. Her sadness, the envelope that had upset her, and what Miss Collins had told him about her son's medical situation. Prince William listened without interruption, his expression growing more thoughtful with each detail. "I want to help her, Dad," George concluded, "but I don't know how to do it properly. I have money saved up, but I know there are rules about these things." Prince William felt a surge of pride at his son's compassion and thoughtfulness. "George, the fact that you've noticed Mrs. Hartwell's distress and want to help shows exactly the kind of person you're becoming. Let me look into this situation quietly and see what we can learn." Over the next 2 days, Prince William made discreet inquiries through the palace's Human Resources Department. He learned that Mrs. Hartwell's son James had been diagnosed with a rare condition that required specialized surgery. The family had been struggling to figure out how to cover the costs that their insurance wouldn't pay. Prince William also discovered something else that touched his heart. Mrs. Hartwell had been working extra shifts and had even asked about taking on additional responsibilities to earn more money. Several of her colleagues had noticed her stress but didn't know the full extent of her situation. When Prince William shared these details with George, the young prince's determination to help only grew stronger. Together, they began to plan a way to assist Mrs. Hartwell that would be both meaningful and appropriate. The royal household has a discretionary fund for helping staff members during difficult times, Prince William explained to his son. But your personal desire to help makes this special. Would you like to contribute your savings to help with James's medical expenses? George nodded eagerly. Yes, but I want to do more than just give money. Mrs. Hartwell has always made me feel special when I see her in the corridors. She remembers things about my school lessons and asks about my friends. I want her to know that someone cares about her too. Prince William smiled at his son's emotional intelligence. What did you have in mind? George had been thinking about this for days. Could we organize something to show her that everyone at the palace appreciates her? Maybe get her colleagues together to write letters or cards? And maybe we could present the financial help in a way that feels like appreciation, rather than charity. The more they talked, the more elaborate their plan became. Prince William suggested they could create a small ceremony, recognizing Mrs. Hartwell's 30 years of dedicated service to the royal household. They could invite her family, including James, and present her with a service award along with a financial gift to help with the medical expenses. George's eyes lit up with excitement, but then he became thoughtful again. Dad, what if she feels embarrassed about needing help? I don't want to make her uncomfortable. Prince William put his hand on his son's shoulder. That's exactly the right thing to worry about, George. We'll make sure everything is done with dignity and respect. The focus will be on celebrating her service and showing appreciation, not on the fact that she needs assistance. That night, George went to bed feeling hopeful for the first time in days. He had learned something important about problem solving. That sometimes the best solutions come from working with others and thinking carefully about how to help someone without making them feel embarrassed or uncomfortable. Unknown to George, his simple act of noticing someone's pain and wanting to help was already creating ripples throughout the palace. Staff members who learned about the young prince's concern for Mrs. Hartwell began to see him in a new light, recognizing a depth of character that went far beyond his royal title. Word about George's concern for Mrs. Hartwell began to spread quietly through the palace staff. Miss Collins, moved by the young prince's compassion, shared the story with a few trusted colleagues. Soon an extraordinary thing began to happen. Staff members from every department started approaching her, asking if they could contribute to helping Mrs. Hartwell's family. The head chef, Roberto Martinez, had worked alongside Mrs. Hartwell for 15 years. When he heard about James's situation, he immediately wanted to help. That woman has covered extra shifts when my own daughter was sick, he told Miss Collins. She's helped so many of us over the years. The palace gardeners, security staff, and even the royal chauffeurs began organizing their own small contributions. What started as George's individual act of caring was transforming into a palace-wide demonstration of support and friendship. Meanwhile, George threw himself into planning the recognition ceremony with the enthusiasm of someone much older. He worked with his father to design a special certificate honoring Mrs. Hartwell's service. He even asked if he could write a personal letter to include with the financial gift. I want her to know that this comes from my heart, George explained to Prince William as they sat together in the study. She's always made me feel important when she talks to me. I want her to feel important too. The letter George wrote was simple but heartfelt. He told Mrs. Hartwell how much her kindness had meant to him over the years, how he had noticed she always remembered to ask about his school projects and friends, and how her warm smile made the big palace feel more like a home. As the day of the ceremony approached, Mrs. Hartwell remained completely unaware of what was being planned. Her colleagues had done a remarkable job keeping the secret, while continuing to show her subtle support during her difficult time. The morning of the ceremony, Mrs. Hartwell was asked to come to the palace's formal reception room for what she was told was a routine staff meeting. She arrived wearing her best uniform, wondering why such a meeting would be held in such an elegant room. When she opened the doors, she was stunned to see dozens of her colleagues gathered there, along with Prince William, George, and to her complete amazement, her son James and her husband Michael, who had somehow been brought to the palace without her knowledge. George stepped forward, his young face beaming with excitement and nervousness. In his hands he held the certificate they had prepared and his carefully written letter. "Mrs. Hartwell," George began, his voice clear despite his nerves. "For 30 years, you've made this palace a better place with your kindness and hard work. You've made me feel special every time you've stopped to talk with me in the corridors. Today, we want you to know how special you are to all of us." Mrs. Hartwell's eyes filled with tears as she looked around the room at the faces of her colleagues and the royal family members who had gathered to honor her. She had always prided herself on being professional and composed, but in this moment, she was overwhelmed by the unexpected recognition and love. Prince William spoke next, explaining how George had noticed her distress and had insisted on finding a way to help. "My son has taught me something important about paying attention to the people around us and acting when we see someone in need." When they presented Mrs. Hartwell with the financial contribution that would cover James's medical expenses, she broke down completely. Through her tears, she looked at George and saw not a royal child, but a young person who had cared enough to notice her pain and do something about it. "Your Highness," she managed to say to George, "I don't know how to thank you. You've given my family hope when we felt lost." George, feeling emotional himself, simply stepped forward and gave Mrs. Hartwell a gentle hug. In that moment, the formal protocols of palace life seemed less important than the human connection between two people who cared about each other. The ceremony that followed was filled with stories from staff members about times when Mrs. Hartwell had helped them, showed them kindness, or simply brightened their day with her positive attitude. What had started as a way to help one person became a celebration of how kindness creates ripples that touch many lives. Among the palace staff present at the ceremony was Senior Guard Captain Thomas Whitfield, a man who had served the royal family for over 20 years. Captain Whitfield was known throughout the palace for his strict adherence to protocol and his unwavering professionalism. He had trained countless guards and was respected by everyone, but he was also known for maintaining emotional distance in his duties. As Captain Whitfield watched the ceremony unfold, something stirred within him that he hadn't felt in years. He observed George's genuine care for Mrs. Hartwell, the way the young prince listened intently to her colleagues' stories, and how naturally he showed affection and concern for someone outside his immediate family. The captain had served 3 generations of the royal family, but he had never witnessed such authentic compassion from someone so young. Most royal children, in his experience, lived in a bubble of privilege that made it difficult for them to truly connect with the everyday struggles of working people. After the ceremony, as staff members were sharing refreshments and continuing their conversations, Captain Whitfield found himself studying George more closely. The 8-year-old wasn't basking in the attention or praise for organizing the event. Instead, he was sitting quietly with James, Mrs. Hartwell's son, asking him about his studies and his dreams of becoming a teacher. "What made you want to work with children who have learning difficulties?" George asked James with genuine curiosity. James, still overwhelmed by the generosity that had been shown to his family, smiled as he answered, "I struggled in school myself when I was younger. I know how it feels to work twice as hard as other kids just to understand the same things. I want to help children who feel that way so they know they're not alone." Captain Whitfield watched as George nodded seriously, clearly thinking deeply about James's words. The young prince then said something that would stay with the captain forever. "My grandmother always tells me that understanding other people's struggles helps us become better people ourselves. I think you'll be an excellent teacher because you remember what it feels like to need extra help." In that moment, Captain Whitfield realized he was witnessing something extraordinary. This wasn't just a privileged child performing acts of charity. This was a young person developing genuine empathy and wisdom that many adults never achieve. Later that evening, as the palace returned to its normal routine, Captain Whitfield found himself reflecting on his own years of service. He had always taken pride in his professionalism, but had he perhaps maintained too much distance? Had he missed opportunities to show the kind of human kindness that George had demonstrated? The captain thought about his own family, his daughter Emma, who was struggling to find work after finishing university, and his elderly mother, who lived alone and rarely complained about her loneliness. When was the last time he had really asked them how they were feeling, the way George had asked Mrs. Hartwell? Over the next few days, Captain Whitfield noticed that the atmosphere in the palace had changed. Staff members seemed more connected to each other, more willing to check on colleagues who seemed stressed or tired. George's simple act of caring had created a chain reaction of kindness that was spreading throughout the royal household. The captain also noticed changes in George himself. The young prince seemed to move through the palace with even more awareness than before, greeting staff members by name and asking thoughtful questions about their work and families. It was as if the experience with Mrs. Hartwell had opened George's eyes to the individual stories and struggles of the people around him. One afternoon, as Captain Whitfield was reviewing security schedules in his office, George appeared in the doorway with Officer Thompson. "Captain Whitfield," George said politely. "Could I ask you something?" "Of course, Your Highness," the captain replied, setting aside his paperwork. George stepped into the office, looking around at the certificates and commendations that decorated the walls. "You've been protecting my family for a very long time. I was wondering if there's anything my family could do to show our appreciation for your service." The question caught Captain Whitfield completely off guard. In 20 years of service, no member of the royal family had ever asked him such a thing. He felt an unexpected emotion rising in his chest, a mixture of pride, gratitude, and something deeper that he couldn't quite name. "That's very kind of you to think of, Your Highness," he managed to say. "Serving your family has been the greatest honor of my career." But George wasn't satisfied with the formal response. "I mean personally, Captain Whitfield, is there something that would make you happy or help your family?" The genuine concern in the young prince's voice broke through years of professional barriers that Captain Whitfield had carefully maintained. For the first time in his career, he found himself seeing the royal family not just as his duty to protect, but as real people who cared about him as a person. Captain Whitfield felt his carefully maintained composure begin to crack. George's sincere question had touched something deep within him that he had kept buried for years. He looked at the young prince's expectant face and realized that giving an honest answer would mean crossing a line he had never crossed before, the line between duty and personal connection. "Your Highness," he began slowly, "there is something, but it's not the kind of thing that's typically discussed between—" "Please tell me," George interrupted gently. "I really want to know." Captain Whitfield took a deep breath. "My daughter Emma graduated from university last year with a degree in art history. She's been applying for jobs at museums and galleries for months, but hasn't been able to find anything. And my mother lives alone since my father passed away 2 years ago. She's too proud to admit it, but I think she's quite lonely." George listened intently, the same way he had listened to Mrs. Hartwell's story. "That must be really hard for your daughter, not finding work when she's studied so hard. And your mother must miss your father very much." The empathy in George's voice was so genuine that Captain Whitfield felt his eyes begin to water. "Yes, Your Highness, it is difficult. Emma is starting to lose confidence in herself, and my mother tries to sound cheerful when I call, but I can hear the sadness in her voice." George was quiet for a moment, thinking. Then he asked, "What kind of art does your daughter like best?" "She's particularly interested in royal portraiture and historical artifacts," Captain Whitfield answered, wondering where this conversation was leading. "And your mother? What does she enjoy doing?" "She loves gardening and used to volunteer at the local community center before the pandemic. She's always been someone who liked helping others and staying busy." Over the next week, George worked quietly with his father and the palace staff to find ways to help Captain Whitfield's family. They discovered that the Royal Collection Trust, which managed the royal family's art collection, had an internship program that could potentially offer Emma valuable experience in her field. They also learned about volunteer opportunities at palace-sponsored community outreach programs that might appeal to Captain Whitfield's mother. But George wanted to do something more personal as well. He remembered how much the handwritten letter had meant to Mrs. Hartwell, so he decided to write a letter to Emma, encouraging her to keep pursuing her dreams and letting her know that her father's dedication to protecting the royal family was deeply appreciated. When Captain Whitfield received word that there might be opportunities for both his daughter and his mother, he was stunned. But when George personally delivered the letter he had written to Emma, along with information about the internship program, the veteran guard felt something he had never experienced in his decades of royal service. Standing in the corridor where he had maintained his professional demeanor for 20 years, Captain Whitfield felt overwhelmed by the kindness of this 8-year-old prince who had taken the time to care about his family's struggles. The formal boundaries that had always defined his relationship with the royal family seemed to dissolve in the face of such genuine human concern. "Your Highness," Captain Whitfield said, his voice thick with emotion, "I have spent my entire career learning how to serve and protect your family with honor and dignity. But you've just taught me something about what real nobility means." George looked puzzled. "I don't understand, Captain Whitfield." "True nobility," the captain explained, "isn't about titles or ceremonies. It's about using whatever power or privilege you have to lift up the people around you. You've shown me that at 8 years old." As Captain Whitfield spoke, other staff members began to gather in the corridor, drawn by the unusual sound of their typically reserved security chief speaking so emotionally. Guards, housekeepers, kitchen staff, and administrative assistants stopped what they were doing to listen. "In 20 years of service," Captain Whitfield continued, his voice growing stronger, "I have protected your family's safety. But you have protected something even more important. You've protected the dignity and hope of the people who serve here. You've reminded us all that we're not just employees, we're human beings worthy of care and respect." The small crowd that had gathered began to murmur in agreement. Many of them had their own stories of George's kindness, a question about a sick family member, a compliment on their work, or simply a friendly greeting that brightened their day. Mrs. Hartwell, who happened to be passing through the corridor, joined the group and smiled at the scene. Her son, James, was scheduled for his surgery the following week, made possible by the generosity that had started with George's observant heart and caring nature. What happened next would become part of palace legend for years to come. As Captain Whitfield finished speaking, something extraordinary happened. The seasoned guard, who had never shown personal emotion during his decades of royal service, slowly lowered himself to one knee in the palace corridor. It wasn't the formal ceremonial genuflection that protocol required during official occasions. This was something entirely different, a spontaneous gesture of respect that came from his heart. The other staff members who had gathered watched in stunned silence. Captain Whitfield had always been the embodiment of professional duty, maintaining strict boundaries between his personal feelings and his royal service. To see him kneeling in genuine emotional tribute to an 8-year-old prince was unprecedented. "Your Highness," Captain Whitfield said, his voice steady despite the tears in his eyes, "I kneel not because protocol demands it, but because you have earned my deepest respect. You have shown me what it truly means to serve others." George stood frozen, overwhelmed by the magnitude of the moment. He had simply wanted to help people he cared about, but somehow his actions had created something much larger than he had ever imagined. Looking around at the faces of the palace staff, he saw expressions of admiration, gratitude, and something that looked like hope. One by one, other staff members began to follow Captain Whitfield's lead. Mrs. Hartwell knelt next, followed by the guards, the housekeepers, and the administrative assistants. Within moments, the entire corridor was filled with palace employees who had chosen to kneel, not out of obligation, but out of genuine respect for the young prince's character. Officer Thompson, who had witnessed George's journey from the very beginning, felt his own eyes fill with tears as he watched the unprecedented scene unfold. In all his years of royal protection duty, he had never seen anything like this spontaneous demonstration of affection and respect. George felt a mixture of emotions, humility, gratitude, and a deep understanding that his actions had somehow touched something important in the people around him. His father had always taught him that being royal meant serving others, but until this moment, he hadn't fully understood the power that genuine caring could have. "Please stand," George said softly, his young voice carrying clearly through the silent corridor. "You don't need to kneel for me. You've all taught me so much about kindness and hard work. I should be thanking you." As the staff members rose to their feet, there was a sense that something fundamental had changed in the palace. The formal boundaries between the royal family and the staff hadn't disappeared, but they had been softened by genuine human connection and mutual respect. Captain Whitfield approached George and extended his hand for a handshake, another break from typical protocol, but one that felt completely appropriate in the moment. "Your Highness, it has been the greatest privilege of my career to serve your family, but an even greater privilege to witness your compassion." Over the following weeks, the story of George's kindness to Mrs. Hartwell and the captain's unprecedented gesture of respect spread throughout the entire royal household. Staff members found themselves working with renewed purpose, knowing they served a family that truly valued them as individuals. James's surgery was successful, and he wrote George a thank you letter describing how the prince's generosity had given him not just the medical care he needed, but hope for his future as a teacher. Captain Whitfield's daughter, Emma, was accepted into the Royal Collection Trust internship program and thrived in her work with historical artifacts. His mother joined a palace-sponsored community outreach program and found new purpose in helping elderly residents in her neighborhood. But perhaps the most lasting impact was on George himself. The experience had taught him that true leadership meant paying attention to the people around him and using his position to lift others up. He began to approach his royal education with new understanding, knowing that everything he learned would someday help him serve people better. Years later, palace staff would still tell the story of the day an 8-year-old prince's quiet kindness moved a veteran guard to step down in respect. It became a reminder that nobility isn't inherited through bloodlines. It's earned through the daily choice to treat others with dignity, compassion, and genuine care. The corridor where Captain Whitfield knelt that day became known informally as the Kindness Corridor among staff members, serving as a lasting reminder that the greatest acts of royalty often happen, not in grand ceremonies, but in quiet moments when someone chooses to notice another person's pain and do something about it.